Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets regular, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Colors. Right. Face. Forward.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our Master of Ceremonies, anchor of ABC News This Week, Christian Amanpour.
Thank you so much. And first, I want to ask you to please join me in another round of applause for the VWMI Herald Trumpets and the VMI Color Guard, and of course, our talented soprano, Millicent Scarlett. So it is really a great honor for me to welcome such a distinguished international audience to be part of the 8th presentation of the George C. Marshall Foundation Award that honors Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. As we begin our evening, we're going to invite you first to sit down and enjoy the first course. And while you're doing that, and while the china or the what do you call it here? The something, it's not the silverware, it's something else. While all that cracks, I want to tell you something. I am really very much in love with George C. Marshall. I'm in love with the Marshall Plan. I'm so deeply aggrieved that in this country, for some unbeknownst reason, nation building is a dirty word. And I am thrilled that in my current job, I can actually ask all the people who matter why that is in this of all countries. So it's fantastic for me to be here and join you all tonight. In all the places of conflict that I've ventured, whether it be Yemen, Afghanistan, and all points between and beyond, it's obvious that after winning the war, we have to win the peace. And so a wonderful Marshall Plan, or a reasonable facsimile thereof, diligent, disciplined, and accountable, is what is necessary, of course, for all these places where we find ourselves. And we know that, we've seen that lesson. About a year ago, I was honored to be able to give the class day speech at Harvard University. And of course, I was very mindful that that is where, in his brief commencement address at Harvard in June of 1947, General George C. Marshall offered a startling idea that was completely at odds with the way victorious nations had behaved in the wake of virtually every major war in history. In the months following his speech, Marshall played a major role in winning public support and congressional support for the legislation that created the European Recovery Program in 1948. And so it was that 17 European countries were rehabilitated rather than degraded, with more than $13 billion in economic and technical assistance. Economic health was identified as crucial to the creation and survival of free institutions and the maintenance of international peace. And American aid was transformed by an army general from military to humanitarian assistance. He was responsible for developing the model that still exists and is still so relevant for post-conflict resolution, as I said, the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Foundation Award was established in June of 1997 by George C. Marshall Foundation to commemorate the 50th anniversary of George Marshall's Harvard speech, and the first recipient was the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. Through its museum, its research library, its archives, and its educational programs, the Foundation is the place where the values that shaped and motivated Marshall are kept alive to this day. And you'll hear more about the Foundation from our first speaker. So please welcome the president of the George C. Marshall Foundation, Mr. Brian Shaw.
Thank you, Ms. Amanpour. We are very pleased you could be here with us this evening. General Marshall had a great respect for the media. He knew that without the free exchange of information, that free societies could not exist. Ms. Amanpour is among our nation's most conscientious journalists. She has received every major broadcast award, and last year she was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She was also made a Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire for her highly distinguished and innovative contributions to the field of journalism. We are most honored to have her here with us tonight. Would you please join me in thanking her? I would also like to thank those individuals and businesses who have generously supported this event and made possible. Their support helps sustain the programs and activities at the Marshall Foundation. In particular, I'd like to thank our friends from L3 Communications and BAE Systems. I also want to express our deep thanks and appreciation to the excellent State Department staff for their assistance in planning this event. In particular, I want to recognize Patrick Kennedy, the Undersecretary of State for Management. Patrick Kennedy has been a great supporter of the Marshall Foundation and a good friend of ours for many years, and we are grateful for our relationship with the State Department. It is an honor to be with you here this evening as part of the gala celebration of the career of Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. You will hear more later this evening from those who have known and worked with Secretary Clinton and know why she is so richly deserving of the Marshall Foundation Award. CIA Director Leon Panetta had planned to be here this evening to be among the tributers to pay honor to Secretary Clinton, but a last-minute change in his schedule prevents his attendance. He sends his best wishes to Secretary Clinton for receiving the Marshall Award. As Ms. Amanpour noted, the Marshall Foundation sustains and promotes the values of George Catlett Marshall. Through our library, archives, and museum, we provide a firm foundation for research on every major event of the first half of the 20th century, which Henry Luce so aptly called the American century. Yet the Marshall Foundation strives to do much more than research. We offer programs in contemporary leadership, education, and international affairs. As we experience periods of unprecedented change around the world, especially in the Middle East, the Marshall Foundation educates and informs the ongoing conversations of the most important international issues of our time, keeping in mind the timeless values and vision of General Marshall. We apply those values and that vision to everything we do. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Michael Strianese is Chairman, President, and CEO of L3 Communications, a long-standing supporter of the Marshall Foundation and a corporate partner for leadership. L3 provides intelligence, analysis, and developmental expertise around the world. Operating under strong ethical principles, L3 products and services enhance the security and situational awareness for both U.S. forces and our allies. Mr. Strianese has been the architect of L3's successful business strategy in an era of geopolitical turmoil and domestic uncertainty. He has developed the company's philanthropic focus to support warfighters and their families and institutions that promote freedom, democracy, and economic well-being in the world. Mr. Strianese is engaged with projects that develop our next generation of leaders, and in that effort has been recognized by the Marine Corps Scholarship Foundation, the Association of the United States Army, and the Army Distaff Foundation. Please welcome Michael Strianese.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is truly my pleasure and honor to be able to make a few remarks tonight. So first of all, thank you, Brian. Mr. Adams, Secretary Clinton, Secretary Albright, General Odierno, and distinguished guests. On behalf of L3, its board of directors, and the 60,000+ employees, and all of us in America's private sector who support the security of this great nation, it is an honor to be with you tonight and to share in the celebration of a truly exceptional American, Hillary Rodham Clinton. Mr. Shah has spoken eloquently of Secretary Clinton's remarkable achievements in the protection and advancement of America's global interests. As a private citizen, I can only add my deep appreciation for both her accomplishments and, perhaps of equal importance, the work she's done in burnishing the image of the United States in the eyes of billions of people around the world. From the perspective of the U.S. private sector, we are particularly blessed with Secretary Clinton's leadership, imagination, and plain hard work. Now, I just had the experience of doing one trip. We do it once a year around the world, and every time I pick up the paper, Madam Secretary, it looks like you're doing it every other week. And it takes me weeks to catch up, so you really, we hold you in awe that you have that pace. From the beginning of her stewardship over America's diplomacy, she has been the primary architect of our nation's integrated approach to national security, which she has called smart power. In an era of almost unprecedented turmoil, complexity, and change, Secretary Clinton has connected the dots of national power, diplomacy, development, and defense in ways that consistently demonstrate the breadth of her vision. In so doing, she has captured the essence of the success of George C. Marshall as he recognized that our victory in World War II could only be sustained with an equally courageous post-war economic development plan supported by a diplomatic surge that endured global endorsement and a strong defensive posture. The dots that Hillary Clinton and George C. Marshall so effectively connected include not only the formal instruments of U.S. power, diplomacy, development, and defense, they also include the impressive array of instruments by which the United States wields smart power to buttress peace, democracy, and prosperity around the world. These instruments include our military, our diplomatic corps, our development community, international organizations, NGOs, and the American men and women in the private sector. Secretary Clinton has worked tirelessly to integrate all of these instruments, understanding the unique contributions that the private sector can make and welcoming us to the Smart Power team. We at L3 are proud to serve side by side with America's soldiers, diplomats, and development professionals, and we are proud tonight to join in honoring Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton, an American for the ages who stands in the same pantheon of great American leaders as the man for whom this award is named. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And now it's my great pleasure, my great honor to introduce a man who's been called America's top soldier in Iraq for his extraordinary service as the operational architect of the surge that ultimately led to such a dramatic decrease in violence in Iraq in 2007 and 2008. In a career that spanned more than 35 years, he's commanded units at every echelon from platoon to theater, and he currently serves as the commander of U.S. Joint Forces Command in Norfolk, Virginia. And he was just nominated by President Obama to serve as Chief of Staff of the Army, a position that was proudly held by General George C. Marshall. So here tonight to pay tribute to one of his heroes, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome General Raymond Odierno.
Well, thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the impressive color guard from Virginia Military Institute. I know George C. Marshall will be very proud of how you conducted yourselves this evening. Secretary Clinton, Secretary Albright, other distinguished leaders from both government and the civilian world. And I have to also recognize, I think I saw Senator Warner here, one of my heroes, and I'm glad to see you, sir. It's great to be here this evening. Christian, thank you so much for that great introduction. It truly is a privilege to be here tonight to honor Secretary Clinton for a career of distinguished public service in the tradition of George C. Marshall. As I've grown up throughout the military, I greatly admire George Marshall for his ability to solve incredibly complex problems by drawing on all sources of our national strength, a leadership trait as important today as it's ever been before. One of America's soldier statesmen, Marshall served our nation during one of history's most challenging periods. He proved to be a leader ahead of his times. He successfully prepared himself and others for a war which few foresaw at the time. And afterward, when history would dictate an isolationist retreat, he developed and implemented a comprehensive plan for European reconstruction and development. Winston Churchill said of him, he's a great American, but he is far more than that. He has always fought victoriously against defeatism, discouragement, and disillusionment. Secretary Marshall's unfailing wisdom, integrity, and vision helped him accomplish the seemingly impossible. He convinced our leaders and citizens to do what must be done, despite whatever the sacrifice might be. So just as I just described, and I do George C. Marshall, I have a deep admiration for Secretary Hillary Clinton. During confirmation as Secretary of State, she remarked, "With every challenge comes an opportunity to find promise and possibility in the face of adversity and complexity." She is a proven leader of the highest distinction. She is not afraid to confront our nation's most difficult challenges head on. And like Marshall, it has been the content of her character that allowed her to do so. And when we talk about leaders, we always talk about character. Over the years, our military has benefited greatly from her dedication to national service. Secretary Clinton has long been a strong advocate for our armed forces. As a senator from New York and a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, her advocacy for quality military, a support to our families is well known. Her dedication and vision for leader development, joint solutions, and pushing for a strong civil-military relations was far ahead of most of our other leaders. Senator Clinton and now Secretary Clinton worked tirelessly to understand the strategic environment into which we were committing our forces. I remember when we first met back in 2003 in Kirkuk, Iraq. She was incredibly interested, prepared, and wanted to understand the issues so she could develop the right solutions. This allowed us to have a very detailed and substantive discussion about Iraq and its future. Her foresight, intelligence, strategic understanding, and strive for success made a lasting impression on me. As Secretary of State, she's always prepared to tackle the most difficult challenges, but in an open, collaborative manner, consistently reaching out to the military as she forms her judgment. In cooperation with Secretary Gates, she has worked tirelessly to ensure the optimal integration of all sources of national strength, recognizing, like General Omar Bradley, one of Marshall's protégés, that wars are won by the great strength of a nation, the soldier and civilian working together. Today, after 10 years of war and in the face of increasing global complexity, we need leaders who will give the best they have. Leaders who will tell us not what we want to hear, but what we need to hear. Leaders who can help us realize our future, a better future. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is one such leader. Madam Secretary, on behalf of all the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardmen, we thank you for your service. We thank you for your dedication to our men and women in uniform and their families. And congratulations on this richly deserved award. We're extremely proud of you, and we know you will continue to lead our nation in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, General Odieno. And I had such a privilege interviewing you in Iraq and elsewhere. And it's really been one of the joys, actually, of my life to have been able to have covered the U.S. armed forces of every discipline throughout just about every conflict and every humanitarian intervention of the last 20 years. So it's great to be here. And I wish you a very nice and pleasant dinner, great conversation. And we'll be back in a little while to continue our tribute to Secretary Clinton. Thank you.
To continue our program, please welcome back our Master of Ceremonies, Christian Amanpour.
Thank you very much. I hope you all had a fantastic dinner. It was delicious. I hope you all had wonderful conversation. And now we're going to continue with our program. General George Marshall was someone who truly possessed that rare quality that we all call vision, and I guess we all wish we had. Few people have it. He did. He could see how society and institutions would eventually and inevitably change and evolve, and how organizations must anticipate these changes and roll with them instead of sort of being caught on the back edge of them. And a perfect example of that, of Marshall's vision, was his advocacy for women in the military. And this was oh so many years ago, and he was arguing against a staunchly opposed Congress early in the war. He became the lead advocate for the creation of the Women's Army Corps and the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and he believed that women deserved a place in our military, and he fought to assure that that would happen, and it has happened, and it's great for all of us who go out and watch them and see them really pulling more than their weight on the battlefield and in all the civil jobs they do as well. Another example of General Marshall's commitment to fairness and equality was his strong defense of Anna Rosenberg. Now, she had come under attack from Senator Joe McCarthy during the confirmation process for her nomination as Assistant Secretary of Defense. And Marshall himself, who became the victim of a heinous attack by McCarthy, defended Rosenberg and defended her nomination, and eventually that led to her confirmation. So, our next tribute is from a world leader who has shattered so many glass ceilings herself. She was the first female president of Chile after becoming its first female defense minister. She left office as one of the most popular presidents in the whole history of her country, and she stepped into yet another first recently at the United Nations. That was the first ever executive director of UN Women. And there's an important meeting of UN Women and Egyptian women's groups in Cairo, and that's unfortunately called her away. But she is here in spirit and in voice and in the beauty of videotape. So please join me in welcoming Michelle Bachelet and her video tribute to Secretary Clinton.
It is an honor and a pleasure to be asked to deliver the topic that I cannot be with you in person. Secretary Clinton is known worldwide for her intelligence, her compassion, and her steadfast commitment to her beliefs, whether on democracy and human rights, weight on gender equality, or with a strong issues such as nuclear non-proliferation and sustainable farming. It's about our work to build new ground for the rights of children and young people. And today, with a real role model for young people everywhere who are trying to find ways to build a better world. And so strongly, and spoke out strongly about critical social issues, including healthcare, which as a doctor went to help in children to care about it, and as well as her concern for all people to have access to good healthcare. As a senator, I admire her ability to listen to people in the way policies adopted, and expressing on family leave and on different work. Not for the first time before, this woman should be replaced. That's what first came to me in 1995, when I heard her say at the Fourth World Conference, and recently Virginia National by the Western Front became famous. Women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights. When she was appointed Secretary of State, she called women's rights the signature of the women's foreign rights central to the foreign policy goals. In particular, theory articulates a new one that goes beyond the friends of the to work with equitable development, good governance, and environmental sustainability. In this context, such as the Global Health Initiative, the Global Internet Treatment Program, are essential to development women. I am committed to making the efficiency of the public government, civil society, and the private sector in many parts of the world, and to supporting the capacity of women's rights to do the same. Secretary Clinton has been a strong supporter of UN women's situation, and has been always, while it was still in the debate of the Assembly. As before, is an example of a commitment to UN women. The President was thinking of organization to meet the challenges of the 21st century, and also the Human Rights Council and its new review mechanism. This practice involved a broad participation with women's rights and other civil society institutions. Technology, data, all of this requires physical activity. It is not hard to be a skill, but in the in the last week of my presidency, she personally took the power to offer assistance. To support her will be here to help in others' needs. And I believe this work also say a lot about Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Well, that was a lovely tribute. And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who's going to introduce Secretary Clinton. She is family to me and to my family. She was the first ever female Secretary of State of the United States in 1997, and she became the highest-ranking woman in the United States government. She's very well known because of her fierce advocacy for all that was right and all that was just during the Bosnian and the Balkan Wars. And we just had a wonderful phone conversation together in the last week when we celebrated, frankly, the final capture of Ratko Mladic, who Madeleine Albright really tried to bring to justice for all those years when she was Secretary of State and beyond, and who was so responsible for the terrible atrocities in Bosnia, particularly the massacre at Srebrenica. And Madeleine, as Secretary of State, and before that as UN Ambassador, was really instrumental in forming the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, and finally bringing justice to people who so desperately needed it. So for her lust, if you like, her in French they say lutter, for the innocents and for the people in the world who need it so much. She has earned so much affection and admiration. And when she was here last, she delivered the tribute to the first recipient of the George C. Marshall Foundation Award, who was the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, and that was on the 50th anniversary of the Marshall Plan, and her distinguished career in public service is way beyond what I just said, and it needs no introduction. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Madeleine Albright.
Dear Christian, thank you. We indeed are family. I think you might not be married to Jamie Rubin if I hadn't put you guys together. So thank you very, very much for your kind words, and it's wonderful to see so many friends here and to have the opportunity to be in this beautiful building again. This is truly an amazing event, the kind that only the Marshall Foundation could pull together. And so I congratulate Brian Shaw and John Adams and everyone associated with this evening's program. The Marshall Foundation is a living reminder of the importance of American leadership and of the pivotal role that economic development plays in the life and progress of nations. As someone who was born in Czechoslovakia, I can testify to the value that the Marshall Plan once held for the people of Europe and for the cause of freedom. In July 1947, my home country's cabinet voted unanimously to attend a conference at which the terms of participation would be spelled out. Hope was very high that in that era of rising tension, the democratic government in Prague could serve as a bridge between East and West. But these hopes were dashed when in Moscow, Stalin demanded that the Czechoslovaks withdraw. He summoned them there, and they did, and soon that bridge had been replaced by an iron curtain because Czechoslovakia was told it could not be a member. And Jan Masaryk, the foreign minister at the time, said, I went to Moscow as the minister of a free country and came back as a stooge. This was a tragedy for my native land, for all of Europe, and for the world. Many years later, I was given the opportunity as America's Secretary of State to welcome the Czech Republic into NATO, and I will never forget that moment. Nor will I forget the moment that I first learned about the diplomatic skills of Hillary Clinton. Now, believe it or not, there is a connection here. The time was in the mid-1990s, and the place was a restaurant in Prague. The First Lady and I had gone to Prague together, and we thought we might have lunch, and it's only natural that I considered myself an expert on the local cuisine, which, as any connoisseur of Czechoslovak food will tell you, is all about cabbage. And I thought that it was important that the First Lady be exposed to the real thing, and so suggested that we order zeli, a kind of hot sauerkraut that can be made in red or white versions. They first brought out a small plate, and I didn't think that was right, so to make sure that she got a real sense of the dish, I ordered a portion roughly the size of the Carpathian Mountains. The First Lady smiled, took a bite, smiled again, took a second bite, and then put down her fork and asked for water. And she told me that it was the very best zeli she had ever tasted. That was when I realized that Hillary Clinton was a born diplomat. Of course, there was a reason beyond zeli that both she and I were in Prague, and that is because of the importance of the Euro-Atlantic partnership. Democratic and Republican administration alike have understood this and have worked diligently to strengthen the many facets of our bond, from trade and diplomatic solidarity to cultural exchanges and economic cooperation. The United States must always exercise its own judgment. We have unique responsibilities and cannot defer or subcontract our security to others, but neither can we be safe if we are always on our own. In this administration, we have a president and a secretary of state that not only care about Europe, They go to Europe, they listen to Europe. And instead of trying to divide the continent into Old West and New East, they are determined to join forces with a Europe whole and free. There are ample grounds for this, including the heritage we share and the values we cherish. But most pressing are the new dangers we confront and the missions we still have to complete in Afghanistan and Libya, the Balkans, and defending our common transatlantic home. And that's why we are so fortunate to have Hillary Clinton as America's Secretary of State. In little more than 2 years, she has helped President Obama to restore our country's reputation and leadership, lent fresh energy to partnerships across the globe, and created a new foundation for progress on issues that range from terrorism and nuclear nonproliferation to human development and democracy. In the process, she has assembled a stellar State Department team, made creative use of every available foreign policy tool, earned the abiding respect of our armed forces and their families, and generated enthusiasm wherever she has traveled. And those of us who have seen her abroad know that she is an incomparable representative of our country. She doesn't just make appearances, she makes connections by explaining the goals that guide our actions and the interests that we share with law-abiding people on every continent. It should come as a surprise to absolutely no one that this woman, who has qualified for everything, has proven to be an outstanding Secretary of State. Now, if Mr. Adams will come up here to help me, I will be very pleased to join with all of you in presenting the Marshall Foundation Award to the person who now holds Secretary Marshall's job, America's 67th Secretary of State, and my very, very dear friend, Hillary Rodham Clinton.
We're here this evening to honor Hillary Rodham Clinton for her service to the nation and to the world. Madam Secretary, in recognition of your selfless service to this country as First Lady, as U.S. Senator from the state of New York, and as our current Secretary of State, for your long-standing support of the U.S. military, its soldiers, families, and veterans, for your passionate advocacy on behalf of women, children, and families in many places where their voices are not being heard, and for your devotion to promoting freedom around the world. It is my honor to present you with the George C. Marshall Foundation Award for 2011.
Thank you all very much. I have a little bit of a Mark Twain kind of feeling that I've been attending my own funeral. I am quite humbled and somewhat embarrassed by the wealth of very kind and overly generous comments, but for me it is an extraordinary honor to be here with all of you, and certainly to receive this recognition from the Marshall Foundation. So thank you, Jay, and thanks to the entire board. Let me also recognize and thank the splendid VMI cadets who are here, including Rachel Singh, who accompanied me to the stage. And I'm especially honored when I think of the prior recipients of this very distinguished award, including my colleague, Secretary Gates, whom I had the honor of introducing in the State Department in 2009. We've had a very special evening with so many good friends here. And Christian, thank you for not only emceeing, but for the role that you've played in bringing so much of the world into America's homes over the last years. To General Odierno, whom I am so pleased will be assuming a new position, subject to Senate confirmation. I learned to say that as a senator. And to the extraordinary presence of all of the sponsors of this event. Michael Stryanis, thank you for your comments. And to Brian Shaw and everyone who has made this evening so special. I want to, in her absence, thank my friend, the former president of Chile, who has her own remarkable life story of resilience and strength, and to my dear friend and predecessor, Madeleine Albright, who has been a colleague and advisor and counselor, and who just recently completed for NATO an incredible job of looking at NATO's strategic positioning for the future, leading a group of very esteemed representatives from across the NATO family. Just one more evidence of Madeleine Albright's continuing service to our country. I think a lot about George Marshall. I have an extraordinary sense of the character and integrity, the commitment to service that led him to perform so admirably on behalf of our country during some of the most challenging times that we have ever faced. Leading our nation in war as a general, in peace as Secretary of State, and later as Defense Secretary, he was, they say, the only man, according to President Truman, who could get along with Franklin Roosevelt, the Congress, Winston Churchill, the Navy, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he did so while never avoiding the hard issues, while always sharing his best advice, speaking his mind. I've seen a lot of people in public service over my time here in Washington who would be well served, and we would be better served if George Marshall's example were followed. I also know from the work that I have done over the last 2.5 years how still contemporary the views that Marshall brought to the fore following the Second World War are today. He certainly spoke his mind in 1947 when he outlined the principles of what became known as the Marshall Plan. He is certainly very well remembered for one of the great foreign policy achievements of the 20th century. Now, many of us think of the Marshall Plan in concrete terms, literally. The Allies won the war with guts and valor, and the Marshall Plan won the peace with bricks and mortar. But there was more to the plan than constructing buildings and bridges. Marshall knew the importance of economic growth to build stability, democracy, and security, not only in Europe, but everywhere. And he knew that the people of Europe needed economic opportunity to rebuild their livelihoods, recover their dignity, and reset their destiny. By spurring the market economy, rebuilding the agricultural base, modernizing industry, and training European business leaders, his plan helped 17 nations, including Germany and Italy, take the lead in their own revitalization. Now, the cost of the four-year plan was $13 billion, which translates into more than $120 billion today. I often think about whether we would today be able to summon that kind of vision of a future that would be in America's interests, but would require continuing sacrifice. You know, my father, who served for 5 years in the Navy during World War II, came out of service like so many men of that generation, and was committed to making up for lost time with his family, with his business, trying to seize as much of the American dream as he possibly could. And here was President Truman and General Marshall saying, well, you've sacrificed a lot during the last years. We defeated enemies that were putting at risk everything we cared about. And yes, you've earned the chance to turn inward and think about all that makes life worth living and wars worth fighting. But we're going to continue to tax you. We're going to continue to require you to help us rebuild the very enemies that you have spent years trying to defeat. It's almost unimaginable that the case was made, that the political environment accepted that case and understood what it meant for us. We can look back now and see how the investment reaped dividends in so many different ways. It prompted European governments to denationalize their industries and strengthen their labor laws. It preempted the westward creep of communism. It helped us lay the foundation for winning the Cold War, and it created strong allies for the United States and laid the groundwork for the European Union. And the Marshall Plan wasn't just important for the rebirth of Western Europe. It became a model for many nations in 1989 after the Berlin Wall came down. By establishing enterprise funds to spur investment in Eastern and Central Europe, we helped post-Soviet countries develop robust economies and new destinies. We were mindful of the lessons of the Marshall Plan in all of the years since. Tomorrow in the State Department, we'll be having an investment conference for Iraq. Some of you have told me you will be there. As we try to help rebuild a country devastated by tyranny and war, to achieve sustainable economic growth. In our efforts in Afghanistan and Pakistan over the last years, we've certainly tried to apply wherever possible some of the Marshall Principles, trying to target assistance toward private enterprise and ramp up existing energy infrastructure such as the electricity grids to attract investment and promote growth. And today, as the Arab Spring unfolds across the Middle East and North Africa, some principles of the plan apply again, especially in Egypt and Tunisia. As Marshall did in 1947, we must understand that the roots of the revolution and the problems that it sought to address are not just political, but profoundly economic as well. Remember the Tunisian vendor whose self-immolation launched the Arab Spring. He was what we might call a very small businessman, whose livelihood and dignity were threatened. Protesters across the region spoke out as passionately for jobs and economic opportunity as they did for freedom, human rights, and a voice in their own government. An extraordinary entrepreneurial spirit is waiting to be tapped in countries like Egypt and Tunisia. Their people have the talent and the drive to build resilient economies and enduring democracies. If we support their efforts, we can help them unlock the region's potential, rebuild their dignity, and realize their hopes. And I argue very strongly, by doing so, we will advance our own security. The United States has asked the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to present a plan that would help stabilize and modernize the economies of Tunisia and Egypt. We have offered, as the President explained in his speech a week ago, to provide up to $1 billion in debt relief for Egypt, and we've issued a $1 billion loan guarantee program to help finance infrastructure and job creation. In addition, we will launch programs to allow private investors to help local companies build new businesses across the region. And we are working with Congress to create the kind of enterprise funds that supported the economic recovery of so many post-Soviet countries. These funds, drawn from existing programs within the State Department and USAID, would give Egyptian and Tunisian entrepreneurs and businesses the capital they need to start new ventures and thereby create jobs. The world took an important step in this direction last Friday when President Obama and the G8 leaders committed at least $20 billion to build economic growth and create jobs. And that complements the strong response underway from the Gulf countries. I think we all understand the opportunity we face and the consequences if we miss it. So as we go forward, we can all learn a lot from George C. Marshall's life, his service, and what he stood for. And we should remember, first of all, that the genius of the Marshall Plan was not in the money it provided. The money opened the door to the reforms that were promoted. That is what we must do today. I am well aware of the difficult budgetary times in which we live. I face that every single day in the work that I do. And I think often about 1947, about my father, a small businessman, a Republican through and through, who was asked to continue sacrificing for his children and grandchildren to help build a more peaceful, secure, prosperous world. Marshall advocated from the moment he launched his plan that we should offer partnership, not patronage, and that we should never lose sight of the real bottom line. Prosperity and freedom abroad mean security and opportunity here at home. And Marshall said the purpose of our policy should be, and I quote, the revival of a working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. This is another important historic moment. I think I can imagine the kind of ideas that George Marshall would be offering, and the challenge he would make to all of us as to whether we are up to this moment. It's not only for Egyptians and Tunisians and others who may follow, but for all of us. So, General Marshall, let me reassure you that the United States is committed to the future of those willing to do the hard work of political and economic reform, to build democratic institutions and open markets, to respect and protect human rights, and create conditions for men and women to fulfill their own God-given potentials. If we recall what George Marshall did all those years ago and the benefits that still accrue to us, I hope we will summon the same will to do what is called for today. And with that, I thank you for keeping George Marshall's values alive and present in this complex and fast-changing world. Thank you very much.
Please welcome back Millicent Scarlett.
Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with we. Let there be peace on earth, the peace that was meant to be, with God our Creator, sisters, brothers, all are we. Let us walk with each other in perfect harmony. Let peace begin with we. Let this be the moment now. With every step we take, let this be our solemn vow, to take each moment and live each moment in peace eternally. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with we.
Thank you again, Scarlett. It's wonderful to have been here. It's great now to have the opportunity to close this magnificent evening with some words of wisdom that General George C. Marshall delivered when he was accepting his Nobel Peace Prize back in 1953. Perhaps the most important single factor will be a spiritual regeneration to develop goodwill, faith, and understanding among nations. Economic factors will undoubtedly play an important part. Agreements to secure a balance of power, however disagreeable they may seem, might likewise be considered. And with all these, there must be wisdom and the will to act on that wisdom. On that note, congratulations to Secretary Clinton. Thank you all, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Millicent Scarlett, and thank you very much indeed. Good night.